All right, so in this video, we're going to cover the Great Depression. And so this is one of the events that's going to lead to the rise of totalitarian dictators in Europe, like Hitler and Stalin. So this is the first step towards understanding why World War II breaks out in the first place. So the Great Depression gets started, or the seeds of the Great Depression get started almost immediately after World War I is over. So if you remember, the Treaty of Versailles imposed heavy economic penalties on Germany. So they had to pay very heavy fines to the Allied powers, and their economy was further sanctioned through the Treaty of Versailles. So their economy was, it shrank as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. In the early 1920s, Germany had trouble repaying loans and sending their fines to France and the United Kingdom. I mean, obviously, Germany had trouble financially as a result of the war. So in response to this, France invades the Ruhr Valley in Germany and just starts extracting coal and iron to meet their payments. So basically, France invades Germany and just starts taking coal and iron to meet the fines that Germany isn't paying. Eventually, France leaves. After Germany receives economic aid from the United States. And after this point, so this happens in 1924. After this, the world economy starts to look okay. But that is false. The global economy is actually teetering on the edge, and the only thing keeping the economy from collapsing is American loans to European powers. So all of this stuff is balanced on the back of American banks. And so this is how the system looks okay, but actually isn't. So we get this very dangerous economic cycle of loans and repayments. So the Americans pay, or not pay, but loan money to the Germans. And the Germans take that money and they send it to the UK and France for loans that they took out during the war. So the Germans pay the UK and France their reparations, the fines for the war. The UK and France then turn around and give that back to the United States because these guys took out loans during the war. So they give the money back to the United States with interest. And so that the cycle starts over again. So then the money goes back to the Germans, who give it to the United Kingdom and France, who give it back to the United States with interest. And this all works okay until 1928, when the Americans, the American Loan Program, called the Dawes Plan, ends. It was only meant to be a temporary fix anyway. And so in 1928, they come up with a new plan, but they don't actually put this new plan into effect because the Great Depression is going to hit before it can get enacted. So in 1928, this program ends, and then everybody is kind of left without any money. The other problem is that after World War I, the market for grain collapses. Remember how we said that South America helped in World War I by supplying militaries with food and other supplies. That's good because it kept the soldiers fed. The problem is, after the war, all the European farmers start farming again. Which means that the supply of food is way up. And the demand for food kind of stays the same, which causes the price of food to drop. So the price of food drops. The supply goes up, the demand stays pretty much where it is, which causes the price of food to drop. So all of the farmers run out of money. So that causes two things to happen. One, they stop buying stuff because they don't have any money, which causes an overall drop in demand across the board. It also means that the farmers have to take out loans to make ends meet. Now, this is not weird. Farmers usually take out loans and pay them back after their harvest sells. But now their harvest isn't selling, or if it is selling, it's not enough to pay back the loans. So the farmers end up defaulting on their loans. And a lot of farmers put up their farms as collateral for the loans, which means that they lose their farms. When demand drops, as we saw here, manufacturers, like factories, lay people off because there's not as much need for the stuff that they're making. So people lose their jobs. Which further drops demand. So all of this is just a nasty cycle of drops in demand leading to drops in money. People don't have any money now. And on top of all of this, we're going to actually give us the trigger of the Great Depression. And this is the stock market crash which happened on October 24th, 1929. So again, the banks are at the center of this. People who are trying to get rich bought stock on what's called margin. And basically, the way this works is you take out a bank loan to buy stock. So you pay, like, usually about 10% of the stock prices, and the bank pays the rest. And then you pay back the bank with the profits from the stock. Now, this is great until the banks run out of money. And so that's what we're seeing here. The farmers have run out of money. Germany and France and the United Kingdom have run out of money. So the banks lent out all of their money, and now it's just gone. So the banks start to call in all these loans. But the money is gone because the stock prices have dropped, the price of food has dropped, the German and French and British economies have collapsed. So the money is just gone. And the way bank loans work, loans work because people keep their money in the bank. And that's the money that's loaned out. So now everyone has lost all of their money. If the bank lost your money is just gone. So people all over the world lost all of their money because of these loans. Now, some countries were hurt worse by this. Now, obviously, this hurt the United States and Germany and France and Great Britain. Some countries were hurt really badly by this, and these are countries that exported single raw materials. So, for example, Brazil's economy was based mostly on the export of coffee. But no one can buy it, and even if Brazil could sell it, they would not get nearly as much money as they needed for it. So in some cases, Brazil dumped entire harvests of coffee beans into the ocean. They also experimented with paving roads with it. Like instead of using gravel, they used coffee beans. So some countries were really, really hurt by this. So Brazil is an example of a country that was hurt especially bad by the Great Depression. Other countries did okay. So, for example, the Soviet Union actually grew during the Great Depression. This is, again, kind of a false view of it. The reason that the Soviet Union economy grew during the Great Depression is because they needed to finish industrializing and rebuilding from World War I. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about Stalinism. But another reason that the Soviet Union's economy grew during the Great Depression is that they were essentially using convict labor to build. So they were essentially using a form of slavery to grow during the Great Depression. The United States initially reacted to the Great Depression through something called economic nationalism. Basically, what economic nationalism is kind of protecting domestic production by imposing really high tariffs. And remember, a tariff is a tax on an import or an export. Essentially, they are cutting themselves off from the world economy. This was a bad idea. The United States puts in place this thing called the Smoot Hawley Tariff Act. In 1930, with the idea being that it would protect American industries. But really, what it did was cause a big drop in American production. Now, as the Great Depression continued, there were a few attempts to try to fix this. So we see some examples of economic experimentation. Basically, let's just see what works. Let's try stuff out. And see if it works. One idea was to do nothing. It'll fix itself. That was pretty much the plan of the American president Herbert Hoover. And technically speaking, he's probably right that if you do nothing, the economy will eventually fix itself. But there's a big cost to doing nothing. There's a big human cost, like in lives and health, if you do nothing. But I think technically speaking, Hoover was right that if you did nothing, it would eventually fix itself, but that's kind of a heartless way of looking at it. You could try to cut spending and raise taxes, but again, nobody has any money, and there's a big human cost to that, because if you cut spending, people are hungry and there's no work. So the government kind of has to step in and help people with food, at least. So there are some new ideas. Because the old ideas didn't work. Now, maybe the newest idea was from an economist named John Maynard Keynes. And what Keynes says is that there is too much labor in the market and not enough demand for labor. So what the government needs to do, the government needs to hire people to do work for the government. And that should jumpstart the economy. Now, the best example of this is in the United States with the New Deal. And basically, the United States hired just about every type of person, so every type of worker, to work for the government. Didn't really matter. They were hiring everybody. Engineers, teachers, artists. Didn't matter. They were hiring everybody. And while it may not have done exactly what Keynes argued it would have done, it did keep people fed and built a lot of needed infrastructure. So roads, power stations, power lines, radio towers, just about anything and everything that could be built, the government hired people to build. They even hired people to make art. And there are really famous examples of some of this art that the government paid for. We see the same thing happen in Sweden, but to a smaller degree. But maybe with more success. Now, Sweden might have had more success because they're a smaller economy and they're a smaller country, but we also see this work in Sweden as well. Now, one last thing we'll talk about is that as the Great Depression kind of ends into the 1930s, governments in Europe react to the Depression, and here we're in the 1930s, by forming what are called unity governments, where all the political parties work together to address the emergency. And at this point, it's not just the economic emergency, it's also the emergency of a growing threat in Europe from Germany. So we see this both in Great Britain, where we see a conservative government works with the liberals. In France, we see all the liberal parties form an alliance. But again, this is now starting to bridge into the threats caused by totalitarian dictators in Europe. So Europe has a double emergency. Europe has this economic emergency, which is ongoing around the world, but they've also got to deal with the threat coming from Germany and also, to a smaller degree, the Soviet Union. So in our next set of videos, we'll start talking about that totalitarian threat. So we'll talk first about what's going on in the Soviet Union after it forms in 1922, and then we'll talk about the rise of Mussolini and Hitler in Italy and Germany. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.